Hello and welcome to the UCR Freedom course. My name is Selena and I will be your moderator. So today we'll be talking about combating mass incarceration with 3 deputy public defenders. We have Tiffiny Townend Blacknell, who has worked as a deputy public defender in LA for 17 years and is a lifelong resident of Los Angeles County. After graduating from Inglewood High School in 1994, she earned a BA in philosophy from California State University Dominguez Hills, and then enrolled in the University of Southern California Law School. Tiffiny received her JD from USC Law in 2002 and immediately began working as a deputy public defender in Los Angeles. Tiffiny has handled misdemeanor cases, juvenile adjudications, as well as complex serious felonies, including murder. Tiffiny is a married mother of 3 and is currently co-chair of the Women's Defender Association, past president of the Black Public Defenders Association, and she serves on the board of directors for a nonprofit Re-Entry Foundation, which assists formerly incarcerated people to reintegrate into their community. She is passionate about criminal justice reform and appears regularly in panel discussions surrounding criminal justice issues. Alisa Blair has been an attorney with the Los Angeles County Public Defender's Office since 2003. During that time, Ms. Blair has led trial counsel in over 50 trials for charges ranging from resisting arrest to first-degree murder, as well as a supervisor in the office's juvenile division. Until December of 2019, Alisa Blair most recently handled juvenile transfer cases where the district attorney is seeking to transfer minors to adult court. Ms. Blair was the 2018 recipient of the Judy Schechter Juvenile Lawyer of the Year Award. Alisa Blair attended the University of California, Berkeley, where she majored in sociology with an emphasis in race and ethnic relations and a minor in African American studies. Alisa went on to attend the University of Southern California School of Law, where she earned her Juris Doctorate. Alisa Blair was awarded the Miller Johnson Equal Justice Award by the law school. Alisa frequently provides guest lectures at colleges and law schools regarding juvenile justice issues and the interplay between racial trauma and the adolescent brain. Ms. Blair has been published on issues of cash bail and juvenile interrogations. Ms. Blair also does trainings on jury selection and client interaction for new attorneys. Alisa is the most recent past president of the Black Public Defenders Association, chairperson of the Law Clerk Recruitment Committee, a member of the Public Defender Union, Political and Legislative Action Committee, member of the George Gascon for LA District Attorney Policy Committee, and internal vice president for the Pacific Juvenile Defender Center. Next, we have Juanita E. Mantz, or Jem. She is a graduate of UCR and USC Law School and is a writer, podcaster, blogger, performer, and lawyer. She has been a criminal defense attorney with the law offices of the Public Defender in Riverside County for over a decade. She specializes in representing mentally ill clients who are found incompetent under PC Section 1368 and the developmentally and intellectually disabled. She has taken many serious felony 1368 cases to trial on the mental health issues, including a murder case where she was successful in having the schizophrenic and cognitively disabled client deemed permanently incompetent. Jem's stories and articles have been published in Al Jazeera, in anthologies, and in numerous other literary journals and magazines. She is also a member of the Macondo Writers Workshop, a writing collective started by Sandra Cisneros for writers who want to change the world. Jem recently finished her young adult memoir and believes that art and writing has the power to change systemic systems. My name is Selena Flores. I'm a student at California State University, Los Angeles, majoring in women, gender, and sexuality studies. I'm an advocate for prison abolition and an anti-imperialist. And I've worked for Young Invincibles and an advocate for young adults seeking healthcare. So for our first questions for discussion, we're going to be talking about abolition. So Alisa, are you an abolitionist, and what does it look like to you in your respective field?
Definitely. I think that, just a little background in terms of what it means to be a public defender or what a public defender is. We are the attorneys who protect everyone's constitutional right to have an attorney, to have counsel when faced with criminal charges. And so in speaking about my field, we're talking about the criminal justice system as the field for all of us. So for me, being an abolitionist means that I recognize we have an outdated barbaric, punitive system that is a direct descendant of slavery. And so our criminal justice system is not only a racist system, but it's an anti-Black system. As such, I don't believe that there is the ability to reform the system. It's often said that the system is acting exactly as it was designed to, and the disproportionate mass incarceration and mass human caging of Black and brown people, of poor people, of mentally ill people, that is all by design. And as such, I think that we have to tear it down. And so that goes from, defunding the police, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit later, the notion of progressive prosecutors. It covers the entire system. And my position is there is no reform. We have to start over, and our current model has to be abolished.
And Juanita, same question to you.
Well, up until some months ago, I would have called myself a reformer. But what the pandemic we're living in has opened my eyes to, and I can't close them anymore, is that, like Alisa said, this system is completely broken. As a deputy public defender, I fought for reform. I fought for mental health diversion, mental health court, getting rid of 3 strikes, diversion programs, legalizing marijuana. But the end result is always incarceration. If someone messes up, you incarcerate them. So when the pandemic hit, it opened my eyes to the fact that my clients were so at risk in the jail, and no one cared except me and their families. There was silence. So in this system that we have, this racist system that, like Alisa said, is a holdover from slavery, the prosecutors and the police have all the power. Before anyone is even convicted, pre-trial, they are incarcerated. That's what bail is. You incarcerate someone unless they have enough money to pay. And then you coerce them into pleading through incarceration. And that's why the plea rate is so high, because 2.3 million people are in jail and prisons and state hospitals. Millions more, 6 to 7 million, are on some kind of probation or supervised parole. And it must be said, this impacts Black people and other people of color and the mentally ill so disproportionately. We need to rethink the whole system, tear it down, start over. I'm 100% with Alisa on this. And I'd like to quote a book by professor and activist Angela Davis. And she really puts it better than I ever could. She said, "What would it mean to imagine a system in which punishment is not allowed to become the source of corporate profit? How can we imagine a society in which race and class are not determinative of punishment, or one in which punishment itself is not the central concern in the making of justice?"
Well said. Tiffiny, this next question is for you. Can one be an abolitionist and be a public defender? Because with working within the system, are you actively perpetuating it?
I think the argument can be made that a public defender does perpetuate mass incarceration, and therefore there is tension between public defense and abolition, right? As a public defender, we are appointed by the courts to defend people who are charged with crimes. And in so doing, we are basically legitimizing the system, right? Because if you're a true abolitionist, the argument goes that you would step out of the system and work vigorously to dismantle it from the outside. But I think that's a kind of a misguided notion, to be honest. I started my career as a public defender in order to usher people to freedom, right? To get people out of the system as quickly as possible, to secure their freedom for their families, for their communities. And so as an individual, I can work for my individual client every single day to secure their freedom. And freedom is the goal of abolition after all, right? And so in that way, a public defender individually can work on their individual clients and their cases to send them home as quickly as possible. But unfortunately, some of the practices of many public defenders are contrary to abolition. I mean, we do have a 96% plea bargain rate, right? And so the question becomes, are individuals being sent to prison at an alarming rate because of public defenders? I think that public defenders need to look at themselves and their individual practices, and we need to look at the profession as a whole in order to improve our practice, and so that we don't simply sign plea waivers, but more so that we utilize the constitutional right to trial and actually try to free people straight away, not on probation, not on parole, not with a short term in prison, but actually win cases. I think public defenders need to work towards making a more perfect system in terms of public defense. Obviously, I'm an abolitionist and believe the system cannot be fixed. It needs to be dismantled. But while we're here, right, we need to work towards doing the best job that we can for the individual client. And many of us, Alisa and I and Juanita included, we actually are both public defenders and activists. So we can do on the micro level, work with individuals to see their freedom, but we can also do on the macro level and work towards legislation and work towards dismantling each of the laws that have created this system. And so I don't think you have to choose. You can work in the macro and the micro, and that's what we do.
I think that gives us a great perspective. And Alisa, earlier you mentioned you believe in defunding the police. So how would it look in your view after we defund the police?
Well, it's interesting that Juanita chose the passage that she did, and this term of reimagining, and I think that we're hearing that a lot. It's obviously not a new notion, but basically this imagining a different society, right? And I think that when you're talking about defunding the police, it's literally taking from their budget, right? A society shows what it values by what it invests in, and not even just financially, but what it invests in terms of time, in terms of, do you care about art? What are the courses that are taught in schools? What textbooks are used? That is the defining moment, I think, for every society. So when it comes to police and their budgets, those budgets have consistently grown over the years until we have this militarized state where more, speaking for LA County, more than half the budget is going to law enforcement. And what that means is more police officers, more vehicles, more tanks, and different weaponry that is not necessary, because the reality is that most of police contact with individuals is self-initiated, right? Meaning that you're getting pulled over for something. It's not the image that the fear mongers try to portray of somebody help me, and police are there on the scene like superheroes, and that's why you need more of them, because how else would this little old lady's robbery be thwarted if it wasn't for a police officer waiting in the wings? The reality is that police are patrolling and using pretextual stops, or the kind of stops where it's really racial profiling, but they'll try to say, oh, the person's, tail light was out, but suddenly, instead of just issuing a ticket, all passengers and driver of the vehicle are on the curb for an extended amount of time in handcuffs. And that's what you see in my community. That's what you see in predominantly Black communities. And so to defund the police means we don't need that many officers, right? We don't need all of this military equipment. We need to take from their budget, and we need to invest that money and show what we really care about, which is mental health services, which is, first responders that actually relate to the call in question. So if someone is having a mental health crisis, if a citizen is really, trying to figure out, what do I do about this person who is obviously in trouble, is reacting to some sort of stimuli that's not there, talking to themselves or taking off clothing in public, or otherwise seeming like they need help, right? Not an arrest, not to be chained and put into a cage, but medication, treatment, housing, basic needs that are actually going to get to the foundation of what our issues are. And so when I advocate for defunding the police, another popular phrase in the title of a book is "We keep us safe," right? Let us address the core issues so that we have a more long-term solution for society's ills. It's not to say that we don't want, clean streets and public safety and all of that, but the notion of how we get there, the notion of who's actually dangerous, those are often inaccurate in terms of what's portrayed to society to get people on board with more police officers. You have more police patrolling, you're going to have more arrests, and you're going to have more arrests for the type of conduct that is consistent across the board. But because the police are more often in poor communities, that's why we see these disproportionate rates of incarceration. We see, Black people representing 13% of the community, but 40+% of the people incarcerated or system impacted. And it's not that we're doing drugs more. It's not that we're more violent. It's not that we're stealing more. It's, again, this oppressive police force. So I absolutely think that we take away their funding. We get rid of school police completely. We get rid of the weaponry and militarization, and we invest in what is really important to us as a cultured and advanced society.
Was beautifully put and really expanded on that. And as far as bail policies, you mentioned the issue with them earlier, Juanita, and I think Tiffiny also mentioned them. But how do you feel about bail policies and how that falls along the lines of abolition, Juanita?
Well, bail is inherently prejudicial. It goes against the presumption of innocence. It is about economics, and it impacts those with economic disadvantage. If you have enough money, then you can bail out on a murder. And frankly, I think all of society would much rather have the man who's charged with a car theft out. He deserves to be out. Even the murderer deserves to be out if they can't prove that he's a flight risk or dangerous to society. And if someone is really that much of a flight risk or that dangerous, maybe they shouldn't be able to bail out. But I don't really believe that anyone should be incarcerated pre-trial. But more to my clientele, I represent clients who are incompetent to stand trial, or at least in that process, who are charged with everything from petty theft to murder. During the pandemic, they changed the bail system, and low-level felonies and most misdemeanors were supposed to be at zero bail. And this just shows you how incarceration is the default. It's the norm, because the crimes which qualified for zero bail, not only did I have to file motions, I had to fight tooth and nail for these clients to get out, because the district attorneys, the prosecutors, were trying to keep my clients in based on their mental illness. It's not only prejudicial, it's discriminatory on people's mental health. And so I think these clients should have never been incarcerated to begin with, is my point though. Why are we incarcerating misdemeanors? Why are we incarcerating someone that stole their parents' car? When I was a youth, I stole my dad's car, and you know what they did? They brought me home. Why? Because my dad called the police to make sure I was safe, not because he wanted me arrested. And I just think that we went way too far in this whole idea that everything deserves incarceration. So back to bail, I think just get rid of it. Just get rid of it. Let OR, release on your own recognizance, be the norm. Let that be the default. Make the prosecutors prove in a mini trial that someone deserves to be incarcerated. And then that will be a just result.
You mentioned the prosecutors previously. So how do you feel about prosecutors' offices, Tiffiny?
Well, that's a loaded question. I think that prosecutors have actually are sort of schizophrenic about their mission, right? What is the goal? What is the desires of a prosecutor's office? Currently, what they currently do is that they punish, right? They actually look at the crime itself, how much time they can get for it, and they actually try to give as much time as possible, right? That is their analysis. The maximum penalty is 10 years, so I'm going to give you 7, right? There's no like analysis of deservingness. There's no analysis of, will this make this person better? Will this make society better? Will this prevent crime? Will this deter crime? Right? There's no thoughtfulness behind their day-to-day actions, right? So there needs to be a cultural dismantling of the prosecutor's offices, the ones that I've worked in. I've only worked in Los Angeles. But it seems as though they don't give any consideration as to why a person entered the system. And because in order to think about how we can prevent this thing from happening again, they actually need to know why it happened in the first place. But there's no analysis in the prosecutor's office. No one cares why a person became committed a crime, right? And then the question is, what do they want to do? They want to punish. They want to warehouse. They want to keep them confined in a space where they don't commit the crime again. So in Juanita's example, car theft. So if you're in prison, I suppose you can't steal cars. But is that fair? Is that just? No, it's not. So in my opinion, the prosecutor's office is completely out of control. They have too much power, and they need to have their power taken away, and they need to change their mission. Their mission should be to make society safer. And then they need to consider how they can do that, not simply by putting a Band-Aid on the issue and caging a human, but actually wondering what will happen once he leaves prison. What do we do then? How do we make our society safer and also more humane? And that is not prison. So I think there needs to be a cultural shift in prosecutors' offices across the country.
Along that same vein, what do we do with violence, Tiffiny? How does society deal with those individuals accused of serious and violent conduct?
Right, and that's the question everyone has. Everyone's afraid for their children. Everybody wants to know, will the boogeyman come and break into my home and rape my wife, right? That's what we think about. But the reason why you know Ted Bundy's name is because he's so rare, right? The boogeyman almost never comes. The fear that people have of the stranger abduction is quite an unusual phenomenon, right? So we should reframe the conversation around violence. Typically what we have when we see a violent crime is you have intimate partner violence. And so the question has to be asked, how do we control that situation? Is prison actually making that person less violent? And the answer is invariably no, right? It's not actually rehabilitating anyone. It's only making people actually more violent. So prison does not answer our questions. If your question is, how do we prevent violence? You have to ask yourself, what is the root cause of violence, right? And so if you move away from a punishment dynamic and into an analysis that is, how do we make our community safer? How do we prevent crime from happening? You look at rehabilitation, right? You look at how systems have caused people to enter the violent space. I always tell people that my clients almost never enter violence by being a perpetrator first. They're invariably more so the victim initially, and then they become the perpetrator eventually. So the question we should be raising is, how do we stop that violence from occurring in the first place? Do we give parents, for example, oftentimes my clients have been abused by their parents. Can we invest in parenting education? Can we invest in basic education? Can we invest in helping the mentally ill become medicated and find housing? Can we invest in education to find job training? Because the root causes of violence are poverty, lack of education, mental health issues, abuse and neglect as children, and drug addiction, right? Those are the things that drive violence. So we should focus our attention on those things and not on just warehousing, because what we're doing now is not working, right? Prison, as it's currently constituted, simply perpetuates more violence, both within its walls and also when they release to the community. So how do we transform that into spaces where people can get what they need while they're confined? If they are confined, we need to focus on services to those people who have committed acts of violence. And then we need to focus on re-entry into the community in a safe and reasonable manner. But right now, there's none of that. And so all we'll keep having is violence upon violence.
Well said. I think that ties in really great with Alisa's point about reimagining our communities after we defund the police. As like you said, a lot of violence comes from mental illness, a lot of harm is caused by mental illness. So Juanita, what about those that are mentally ill and are actually violent, not just perceived as violent?
Well, I represent the most mentally ill in the system, and they're often victims, like Tiffiny said. They're, I think, at least 3 to 5 times more likely to be victims as well. And there are studies that say about 50% of all those incarcerated are mentally ill. I actually think the number is higher. I think it's in between 60 to 75%. I think what you do with the mentally ill is you try to get them better. It's really about reimagining this society where we have treatment beds, where we have space for people. You cannot incarcerate a mentally ill person in a cell for 23.5 hours a day like they are right now during COVID and expect them to be anything but worse when they come out. And you cannot send these people to prison and do the same thing to them. They need places in the community, but no one wants it in their community. We need bed space. Right now, the bed wait list to get into a state hospital is 6 months. 6 months to get a state hospital bed. And there's none because they're all having COVID outbreaks. This system was broken before COVID. Now it's unworkable. It's unmanageable. There's days where I do not even want to be a public defender in this practice field anymore. But then I think, what will happen to these clientele if I leave? Because I'm one of 3 that are very experienced in this field, and we handle every incompetent client in Riverside right now and banning. So I think we want salvation for our clients, not incarceration. Freedom is the goal, like Tiffiny said. And also changing the mental health responders and making sure that when someone goes to a house that they know how to de-escalate someone that's mentally ill, that they don't kill them, that they don't harm them, that they don't hurt them, that they actually help them. And a lot of crimes are very petty that get prosecuted against the mentally ill, and they will stay in months and months in jail waiting for a mental health bed on a misdemeanor that never materializes. This is the definition of insanity. It's doing the same thing over and over again and getting the same result. It's an exercise in futility. And I guess the place I'm at now is I really need to tell my clients stories. I really need to speak out to the media, to the public, to students about how horrific this system is, how broken it is. There's a book by Alisa Roth called Insane, and the title is The Criminal Treatment of the Mentally Ill in America. And that title says everything, because that's what it is. It's criminal what we are doing to the mentally ill, and most of which are Black and other peoples of color. So it's not just the mental illness, it's the intersection between race, poverty, and mental illness. And it's just horrific. And so that's not a hopeful ending, but there is hope if people like us, like Tiffiny and Alisa, keep on speaking out, and maybe we, start our own nonprofits. I don't know what to do with the bed space issue, but people need a place to go. And right now with COVID, there's going to be more and more people on the streets with mental illness. So I'm really terrified. The incompetency rate right now in Riverside County is through the roof. I have more cases than I've ever had in my life, and I've been doing this a very long time. So.
And as we know, juveniles are not absent from the mentally ill. And also we have to think about what are the ways that we can reimagine, as Alisa said, what we do with violent juveniles or how we treat violent juveniles. So what would be your approach to that, Alisa?
Well, so the interesting thing with dealing with youth is that there is so much science and so much research which really makes clear the ability for youth to be rehabilitated very quickly and, dare I say, easily. Much to Tiffany's point in terms of when is one's first introduction to violence, right? This notion of treating or being treated a certain way. And so with our youth, especially the youth who become system impacted and involved, so often it's a direct result of trauma, whether that's community violence, violence within the homes, poverty, I say, which is, really a sad reality. But so often when you are doing defense work with juvenile clients, we are the first time kind of that gateway into a possible diagnosis of mental health issues that are onset, and also of cognitive functioning delays, of intellectual disability, fetal alcohol syndrome, spectrum disorders, all of these things that we take for granted or sort of hear the terminology but don't really know how to diagnose. And so you have that student who is always acting out in class or is problematic, and so often there's no testing, there's no educational testing, there's no counselors in the school. They'll have a school police officer and a probation officer, but they won't have somebody who can identify learning disabilities or intellectual challenges you know, where you can totally change the trajectory of a young person's life by saying, oh, you need to be able to stand up. You know, our current educational structure, and not again to go off into another really damaged system, but it's so rigid, you know, and to say, all right, you have attention deficit disorder, totally workable, you're a bright young person, but being in a classroom of 40 other students and confined to a desk and, you know, doing work that maybe you don't understand, or that, you know, it's not being explained in a way that your mind comprehends, it leads to these behavioral problems. And then we get to this school to prison pipeline, right? We have this overworked system, overburdened system that says, if you're disruptive in class, then I need to protect the good students. And so I'm going to remove you. And statistically, that pathway from suspension, you know, not having anything to do during the day, to later having contact with the delinquency system and being incarcerated, is a direct correlation. We know that, you know, that brain is not fully developed until a minimum of age 25. There's some research that suggests even into the early 30s. And so when a young person has engaged in an act that is deemed violent, again, much to Tiffany's point, usually that is within a community setting, within a family setting. But even so, you have to look at, okay, well, what caused this situation? And if we're looking at peer influence, if we're looking at the different ways that substance use can impact an adolescent brain, if we're looking at trauma, then it's very easy to just redirect. You know, evidence-based therapy practices are far more useful in changing a path than incarceration. Like Tiffiny said, you know, whether it's juvenile halls or camps, or, you know, when the prosecutors are successful in trying juveniles as adults, which is absolutely absurd. It flies in the face of understanding there's a distinction between children's brains and adult brains. But you then say, okay, this person is getting out. You know, the reality, and this goes for juveniles and adults, there are only so many crimes where you are locked away forever, right? Most crimes have a maximum confinement time, and you are letting someone out who was damaged to begin with. And this, of course, is assuming that people are guilty, because part of the system, of course, is the ways in which we criminalize and push through. And, you know, because of bail, because of incarceration, innocent people plead all the time. Innocent people get detained for years of their lives before they're exonerated. But assuming that someone actually committed said offense, they then come back. They come back to society, and now they are, you know, too old for treatment. Now that redirection, because the brain has solidified, and that plasticity that allows for new synapses and new brain patterns to develop has shortened, has hardened. It's much harder then to redirect somebody. And so it may seem callous in the moment to disregard a violent act, but we have to recognize that that was one moment. I mean, you take a shooting and you take, you know, really the short amount of time that it takes to pull a trigger. And you think of this brain that is not fully developed, that can't think about consequences, that has poor impulse control, that has all these factors playing in. And then you take that, you know, second to pull a trigger. And yes, it is a lifelong consequence. And yes, I certainly, with all of my notions of abolition, I'm also a pacifist and value life at every level. But there's no point in destroying two lives. I think for juveniles, we have to get away from this notion of, you know, the super predator, of that like late 80s, early 90s depiction of feral, amoral, violent young people, and recognize that these are children and they are the easiest to fix, if you will.
I think it's going to take a lot of bravery and encourage for people to change their minds in terms of how they look and think about people who commit crimes. And I think that folks need to actually be, like you said, be data-driven and evidence-driven, and not emotionally driven in terms of how we handle these conversations. Because human life is very valuable, and to have 2 million people caged in this country, more than any developed country in the world. We are the most incarcerated nation in the world. For us to actually be proud of that it's sort of a gross undervaluing of life, right? Those are someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's father, someone's mother that are caged all across this country, and we need to think about ways to mitigate that, to rethink and reimagine what our responses are to violence. And I think that a lot of the times when people understand the stories behind a violent act, they become more empathetic and their hearts change about how we handle it. I once had a young woman who was charged with robbery, purse snatch, and of course no one wants their purse snatched and their property stolen. And so she was charged with robbery, which is a violent felony, which the DA wanted to give her prison for. And it took very few minutes for me to understand what happened on the date of the crime. You know, is it true, is it not true, or so on and so forth. But when I looked closer at her, I could see a tattoo across her cheek. And I remember asking her, what is that on your face? She goes, it's my brand. And I go, your brand? And she's like, yeah, my pimp maybe put his name across my face. And that, to me, started a long conversation about how she got here. And when I learned more about her, I realized she was trafficked as a child, sex trafficked. So this young woman who society wants to cage because of her violent act, if one considers that violence, she had been through so much trauma before she got to me that no one seemed to heal. No one cared to look into, no one cared to support her, to give her help, right? Rehabilitation, to give her trauma therapy, to give her housing, to give her psychotherapists, anything, right? And so now that she has entered this other stage of her trauma, right? Her response to trauma was violence. Now we want to cage her, which further traumatizes her, right? And so I think that society doesn't know the stories that we know as public defenders. They see just the police report. They don't hear the stories that we hear from their mothers and from their girlfriends and from their wives and children. They don't know the whole person. But if they care to look, I think that we would quickly see why someone ended up in the criminal punishment system. I don't think it's very complicated at all when you have people who commit. I'll tell you another story about a client who bludgeoned his mother to death. His mother, the person he loved the most. And that's a horrible act. And people would respond and say, you need to go to prison for the rest of your life for that murder, right? But when you look into the case, you see a schizophrenic man who was cared for by his mother, but they were too poor to afford the medical care that he needed, right? So what do? They go to a free clinic, they get all the help that they can, but at the end of the day, when she called the clinic for help the morning of her death, no one was sent. She was told to wait to her appointment next week. She was told that try to give him more medication, but she wasn't given the tools she needed to help her very sick son. And so this horrible thing happened. Hours after she cried out for help to the clinic, she was dead. And we look at the act and we want to confine forever, but no one was with her through those 35 years she tried to help her son, right? And even though we know as a mother, she would never want her son to be put in prison forever. Society needs to do better at responding to these things, the crisis before the violence happens, and not just be reactionary and punitive, right? But they need to know the stories. And I think Juanita does a great job of that, telling her stories. I think it's very powerful, and it could change the culture of punishment in the system and abolish that.
And I think there's another piece, and Tiffiny, you talked about it before when talking about the Norway model. When you think about like that movie, A Time to Kill, and Matthew McConaughey is doing the closing argument for, on behalf of Samuel L. Jackson, and he takes the jury through this, and this is taking place in the South, and he takes them through the crime that happened to Samuel L. Jackson's daughter. He's telling them, close your eyes. And then he says, now imagine she was white, right? To this all white jury about the horrors that happened to the little girl. And so I think that, and I would ask Tiffiny to kind of expand on how she explained it previously in a discussion, but we don't see, because of the racism that we can't hide, this is a racist system, this is an anti-Black system. We don't see these people as people for a reason.
Yeah, it's interesting because in other countries, right, there have been people who are abolitionists, people who are in the criminal punishment reform system space that have traveled to European countries and have looked at how they respond to violence. And in Norway's example that Alisa gave, where people, almost everyone gets out, right? There's no crime in which you are given life without parole. There is no death penalty, right, in Norway. And so the prisons look different. They are open spaces. People walk back and forth. People go home for weekends. People return. They have jobs on site. I mean, the system is very, very different. And the question you have to ask yourself is why? Norway is a homogenous society, right? Everyone looks the same. And so there is no othering, right? And we have in the United States, we have a history of caging and chaining Black people from the inception of this country, right? And we're very, very comfortable thinking about Black men in chains because they've always been in chains. Let's just be honest. And so now when you see a million people who are incarcerated, and the predominant number of them are Black and brown, we don't find it offensive to the eyesight. It's not horrible. No one thinks about the communities that are destroyed because of it. Because we're used to having an underclass. We're used to having people working, for example, in the southern states, they have chain gangs, right? They make their own, they grow their own food, they work in the land, they till the land, some of the same land that were once plantations, right? You still have Black prisoners working on that same soil that their ancestors worked on as enslaved people in this country. And there is no accident to that. There is a correlation between America's comfort with mass incarceration and its history of enslavement, right? There just is. And you can look no further than European countries to see how differently they respond to crime and violence. In the United States, for example, one of the only developed countries with a death penalty, right? And the death belt in our country is the southern states. And those southern states were slave states, were lynching states, right? There is no question that is the source and the root of our problem with incarceration is slavery.
Yeah, I'm going to put us all in gallery view so we can kind of have a discussion right now, because the way all of you express it is so powerful in the sense that we know why things are the way they are, and everyone has wanted to ignore it for years. But I guess my question for everyone is, where do we go from here? How do we tell our clients' stories better? When we had our Black Lives Matter rally, I started my speech with, I could have done better. I have failed as an ally. And so, and I feel like I try really hard and I still fail because sometimes I don't listen to my clients' families as much as I should. Sometimes I don't tell my Black clients' stories as much as I should because I have so many clients. So, I mean, it's really about like, how do we tell these stories that are so many stories? How do we help our clients tell their stories? How do we help the system? How do we tell the system's story? How do we, and for me, I think that there is something about poetry that captures the inhumaneness of the system, sometimes more even than prose can. So I've been experimenting with some poetry, because it has a more powerful resonance. So what do you all think, all of us, Selena, Tiffiny, Alisa, about how we use art to shape the narrative?
I mean, I think that historically, especially within African American culture, art has always been a significant part of storytelling in terms of music. When you look at the blues, when you look at jazz, when you look at hip hop, when you have rap songs that are fuck the police or fuck Donald Trump. I don't know if we need to bleep that out, but those are real titles. So I think there is something very significant to that. I have a good friend, Mike De La Rocha, whose entire life's work has been about, meshing artists and athletes and advocacy and work through art. So I think that's extremely significant. I think just on a personal level, doing stuff like this, regardless of when this is actually seen, I am a mom of 2 children recording this in, my office space in my house on a Sunday because it's important to me, and of course there has to be promises of, bike riding and ice cream afterwards, especially in a pandemic where my kids are really like, all we see is this house. But I think that we have a personal obligation, from Christian history is the notion that to whom much is given, much is required. I think that once the lights have been turned on, I often tell the story of how, electricity helped with public health because people could see in their homes how dirty they were, right? You now have new light and you have different access then to cleanliness because you're like, oh, it's dusty over there. And it trickled into ending a lot of diseases and, leading to more hygiene, right? We have shined a light on these issues. I think for those of us, all of us who've been in this field for so long and have been impacted, we have our stories, we have our anecdotes, and we can't sit back. Much to Tiffany's point, I did a hearing, on Friday morning, and the entire time I'm sitting next to a client who was chained at the ankles, who had a chain around his waist and then was handcuffed to that waist chain. And it's true, as upsetting as it was to see him like that, because now, of course, I've got to know him, I know his story. No one blinked in the courtroom. No one was appalled. No one, felt like I've never seen anything like it. We see Black men in chains throughout our history, and it still happens on a daily basis. And it's very easy if you're not in this space to ignore that or to become desensitized. And I think we have to continue to agitate. We have to continue to speak. There is no other way.
And being a public defender is no small emotional feat, right? If you care at all about the people that you serve, you're going to be impacted by it. There have been times where I had to take mental health days because I just could not bear to see another police officer fabricate evidence in a hearing, or I could not bear to see another client, or when our clients are mentally ill and are suicidal, they put them in this Velcro jumpsuit that's just a dress essentially, and they're naked underneath, and they're oftentimes cold, and they're chained around the waist and the ankles like Alisa described. And you want to do something to help them, but they claim they're danger or risk, and so they have to confine them. And they're oftentimes sitting in a holding cell waiting for their cases to be called in court for hours at a time, and they're chained the entire day. And it just breaks your heart. And so I find that oftentimes public defenders get a little compassion fatigue and burnout. And so they start to sort of turn off because the trauma is too great. And they're afraid that if they look deeper into the eyes of their clients, if they sit with another mother who's crying about her son being kept away from her, that they would break. They fear they would. Literally, I had a client once who was 15 in adult court facing life in prison. And I felt like if I lose this case, this might be the end of me. Like I might not be able to recover from this trauma. And so we have to take care of ourselves. Well, number one, the government needs to fund public defense all across this country far better than they do. You have people who are idealistic, who are hopeful, who are energetic, who begin this profession and they're broken by it because of the volume of cases that we carry. We represent everyone's unwanted, right? The least of our kind, right? They want to characterize them in this way, and therefore there's no value in our work, and they don't fund us the way that they should. But in fact, if they knew how much soul churning work that we do, they would put more value in it, because we're oftentimes the only person in court supporting that human being, right? We're it for them. We walk them down sometimes a very dark path, and afterwards we have to just move on to the next case. And so I think that we should, number one, fund public defense in a more, equitable way across the country. And number two, I think we need to train our public defenders to tell those stories, to learn about our client's story, to not just focus on the four corners of a police report or of a case file, but look deeper in order to sort of advocate for the client to be treated as a human being, to be actually rehabilitated and not just warehoused. And I think if we did that, if we demanded that the system see our clients, see their families, hear their stories, if we make everyone stop shuffling papers, stop calculating numbers of years, but just watch and listen and look at our clients as humans, we would get a far more favorable outcome to these cases. But it will take us to have more time with our clients, to know what questions to ask, to know how to develop the relationship and build trust, and to then advocate in a more holistic way to the system to demand some modicum of justice for our clients. That's what each of us have to do in each and every one of our cases.
Yeah, because we are witnesses, right? We are witnesses to this horrific system. We are witnesses to an untold time right now. We are, I just saw the movie Clemency, and it's about the warden and a death row inmate, and how it spoke to me. I'm not a warden. I would never be a warden. I would never be a prosecutor. But how it spoke to me is how every person in this system is negatively impacted. Public defenders, our mental health suffers, my soul suffers, all of our souls suffer. We care about these clients so desperately. I can tell you, Alisa and Tiffiny, more than anyone, even in law school, you cared more than anyone I know. And I know how hard it must be. And so, you know, I want to start as like an organization, because I work in writing communities, to kind of merge public defense and writing, and maybe let our clients' families tell their stories too, give them an outlet, you know, do some readings where people from the community can come in and talk about negative impact of incarceration, the negative encounters with police, and like just shine more light on this, like Alisa said, like, and Tiffiny, like that idea that, you know, this light can actually be cleansing and can bring healing. That's the only hope I see.
As someone who is outside of the system and would, you know, possibly be going into it, I think one thing that is really harmful about the system we have is the disappearing act that happens when someone goes into jail and they're no longer heard. And I think, as someone who has suffered with mental illness and like has been in those mental health institutions before, I think one of the number one things like people working with mentally ill people can do is teach them to tell their own stories, because that's something that a lot of people struggle with, because it's something you're not told to talk about a lot of the time because it's a shameful thing. And I think just incarcerated folks in general being able to tell their own stories and being able to have that contact with the outside world that, you know, the system doesn't want them to have at all is something that can be really powerful. And so, yeah, I mean, even Juanita, if you could create like an anthology where your clients tell their stories from inside, which I know is really hard to do because it's not what's supposed to happen. But I just think making incarcerated people more visible and having that access to talk to the outside world and their families as well, talking about the impacts on the outside for them and what goes on is more powerful than anything, because a lot of times people don't know what it's like in prison. I mean, I don't know what it's like in prison as much as I try and learn and listen to people.
I don't know if Tiffiny and Alisa, you want to talk to that concept that Selena just was so powerful. Thank you for sharing, Selena, your personal stuff too. It really means a lot. But that concept of people disappearing into the system, I got goosebumps when I heard that, because it's so true. Our clients go into this almost like a well, and they're at the bottom of it.
You know, what's interesting is that I grew up in the early 90s in Los Angeles and Inglewood, and it was during a time where many of these draconian laws were created, and they were crafted after the 92 rebellion, 3 strikes law, et cetera, charging juveniles as adults at a younger and younger age. And that was actually my lived experience, being in a community that was directly targeted by legislators to over-police us, to militarize the local police force, to cage us at a higher and higher rate. And I remember reading an article in the New York Times a few years ago about the children of the meth epidemic, right? And it told stories about these white families in the Midwest and how these grandmothers were taking care of these children because their parents were addicts and overdosing. And I got so upset by it. I was so triggered by it, because I come from a generation where we were the children of the crack epidemic. And Black grandmothers held the communities together during that time because our parents were lost to this addiction. And how they responded to us was by building prisons, right? That's what happened. They just warehouses, and it is very true. People did disappear from our families, from our communities, from our schools, and we never saw them again. I had a friend in high school that had disappeared. I saw him last year for the first time since I was 14 years old. And he, of course, he had been in prison several times, But it was so surreal because literally he was here one day and gone the next. And no one ever even discussed it with us. No one ever even talked to us about how that made us feel. It was just a horrible time. And to your point about people closest to the problem are closest to the solution, right? And so we do need to hold space with folk who've been in prison. I remember when my own cousin was convicted of murder about 11 years ago. And the day he was found guilty, and many people don't know this actually, but the day he was found guilty, I went to a tattoo parlor and I got the number of years, days, and months he lived free. And it was for me so that when I would go take a shower every day, no one else can see it. I'm not under a bathing suit, but only when I'm alone in my shower can I see this number. I will never forget him because that is what I want to do. I didn't want to lose that because I know how that happens 20, 30, 40 years from now. When I'm old and gray, he'll still be there, right? And it's so important for us to not forget them and to not let society disappear them, right? That's what we do. As Angela Davis quote is that, prisons don't solve social problems. They disappear them. They just remove them from our eyesight. That is what's so damaging about it, is that we think we've cured something or we've kept the crime rate down, but in actuality, we've just hidden it. We've just hidden it. And with that hiding, we're also hiding human beings.
Alisa?
I mean, I agree. This is one of those, and I know is often the case when all of us are having a conversation, but it's, that preaching to the choir. I mean, absolutely, people disappear. And then even when they return, because again, not everyone is getting life, they are shadows. They're like in this transitional ghost-like state until the next time that they are arrested. And so often I have cases where the actual conduct, and this is if you believe the police and the client is like, yes, that is what I did. The conduct is so ridiculous. And then I'll get this offer of, double-digit years. And I'm like, what? You're suggesting 10 or 20 years or something for, this breaking into a car, and the owner came out and said, hey, get out of my car. And my client said, oh, sorry. Like, how do you justify that? And the justification is always, well, he has a prior strike, or he has this prior conduct, or we already gave him a misdemeanor back in 2017, and so now, even though this conduct could be charged as a misdemeanor, we have to ratchet up. And it's this stair step type of, much to Tiffany's earlier point, it has nothing to do with the individual at that moment. It has nothing to do with the conduct. It's just looking at a sheet of paper and saying, okay, according to what this supervisor told me in this most recent memo, this equals this number of years. 3 strikes is an example. We kind of throw that around as though everyone understands, but this cumulative prosecution or punishment system, there are people who have strikes alleged against them in order to increase their punishment, and their strikes were convictions that existed before the strike law existed. Where's the justification in that? Or the Supreme Court has held that in order to be convicted of a strike, you have the right to have that proven by a jury. But juveniles don't get a jury. And yet 16-year-olds can be convicted of offenses that qualify as strike conduct once they become adults, even though they had no right to a jury trial, even though they had no right to bail. Like Tiffiny says, in terms of time, I try very hard to dispel the notion of being so overworked that my clients don't get my best, right? I think I came into this field knowing that I had to keep up a different pace. Being a public defender, I think we all agree, is different than just being a criminal defense attorney where you can pick and choose your cases. But that said, there is this balance of, I have someone in custody who wants to get home, and what is my fast route to that, right? And so, where I am often frustrated is I have a client who may need some underlying assistance, but if I'm in a position where I can get them out, get them a sentence that doesn't have the collateral consequences of, strikes and all that sort of thing, that's often the path, because I am so troubled by knowing that people are spending more time in custody, and usually it has nothing to do with me, but I feel much, going again to the point of like self-care, and that I feel so guilty if I go on a vacation and that vacation, forces me to ask a client to waive time or continue their case, for the days of my vacation, or I am taking longer than necessary to get to resolution. In the course of my career, I have had two incredible losses, a child and most recently my mother. And in both times I was back to work within a week, because my sadness can't, in my world, in my code, it can't overtake my client's experience. And so I think that, obviously going off beyond just the notion of disappearing, that conviction, that prison sentence, it has a lifelong impact. Every time someone goes into a cage, every time someone is treated as less than human, we take a piece of them away forever until they literally disappear.
And let me just also say that in terms of the narrative of the overworked public defender, all counties are different, right? All states are different, have different funding system. I think Alisa and I, we can speak for LA County, is that we're fortunate enough to have a reasonable caseload in terms of public defense. Some of the people in the southern states don't have the luxuries that we have, don't have the access to resources that we have, don't have the ability to appoint experts, don't have the ability to, have an investigator investigate the case. And so we are we kind of have a charmed public defender life. And so that's why I kind of made the point to say across the country, we need to be funded better, because it's not just LA County, which does fund our offices pretty well, but it's also across, in New Orleans, it's also in Alabama, it's also in Mississippi, and they don't have the same luxuries that we have. But also, I think that we cannot gloss over what harm that we're doing to ourselves as a country. We call ourselves the exceptional country. We're American exceptionalism is touted as part of, of our inherent greatness. And how can your country be as great as you claim it to be? How can we be lovers of freedom when we have the most incarcerated nation on the planet? And I think that we are exposed to be the hypocrites that we are because we have allowed this to happen. And that, like to Juanita's point about the warden, we're all diminished because of it. We're all as a society, we're diminished when we execute a person, when we cage a person forever, when we cage children with adult sentences. We're lessened as a society because we've proven that we don't value the lives of those people, and we don't really value freedom at all, and was all a sort of failed experiment to begin with.
And in these times of COVID, it's really testing who we are. We're putting ourselves at risk going into court, but am I gonna appear on a phone call when my client is there? Hell no. If I get it, then I'm gonna get it because I'm doing my job and I'm representing my clients. And, I had a client's family call me and, I am overworked right now. This is the most overworked I've been. Riverside is funded decent, but right now mental health is overwhelmed with how many clients are incompetent. I'm keeping up, but I can't take a day off. I haven't taken a day off. I've taken one day off since COVID started. One day. And I just can't. I have to work because I got to keep up. And a client's mother called me, and it turned out that the client had a meltdown in custody because her father died. And who's telling that story? Who's telling why this client picked up another case? Because her father died when she's in custody. She's been held for months waiting for a bed that hasn't materialized. And so, I think COVID is testing an already broken system, and it's just going to continue to stress and stress and stress. And then I think eventually it's just going to fracture completely. And I think we do have to rebuild it. We have to get prepared to rebuild the system because it was already broken, and now it's actually going to just disintegrate, much like our economy and much like our society right now in some ways. So.
Not even sure, maybe at the end we could kind of give our closing thoughts about how to move forward with a reimagined system. But you know, I'm not sure that it's you know, I think it's exposing us, right? I don't know that COVID's testing us or making something or like causing additional exacerbations maybe, but I think more so it's exposing it, because people talk about, oh, you know, you can't socially distance in prison. That was always true, right? You create a system where the cages are like bathrooms, and 2 or more adult people are forced to live in such confined spaces. That has been true for quite some time. Now people just see it for the health hazard that has always been, right? Of course, it's more dangerous now because of COVID, but those we allowed them to build cages that are like tiny for human beings to live in. And now we see how damaging it is to them. And I think at this point, 5 people have died on San Quentin's death row. And that's because you've allowed a system to exist where we execute the elderly. We execute people who are not a risk anymore, who, if they ever were, right? And so that's what you've done. So when you think about people on death row, don't think about Ted Bundy at 30 years old. Think about like your grandfather. Like, how much harm is he gonna cause if he was released, right? But we see that. We see that we have a geriatric jail population because COVID is hitting the elderly very, very hard. And what we've done by caging folks with these astronomical numbers, 300 years to life, you know, life without parole, 85 years, right? We give them these numbers like they're months or like they're days. And what you found yourself in is with a geriatric prison population who are extraordinarily high risk for dying of COVID. But those old men were always there. We just didn't give a damn. And I'm not sure we do now, to be honest.
Thoughts, Selena? Do you have any comments? And then we'll go to Tiffiny, Alisa, and then I'll go.
Juanita, I think you said before, like something about like, oh, like, yeah, like it's been exasperated or something, but I don't think that's the case. I think it's just kind of at a point where people who aren't impacted by it are just, it's harder for them to look away now. Like you said, you can't close your eyes anymore. And I think that just kind of speaks to your own privilege because things have kind of always been this way for a really long time. That was my final thoughts. And then as far as anyone else's final thoughts, anything else you want to end with, any continued reading that people think the watchers should be doing after this, or?
You know, now especially that it's a movie, in terms of reading, I think that Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson is always a great one because you have that combination of education and story. I think that there are certainly a lot of textbooks and you know, kind of more heady and intellectual things. I think in terms of recommendation, 13th, the documentary by Ava DuVernay is something for our visual learners. I think the new Jim Crow. But in terms of wrapping up and despite everything I've said, being an optimist and wrapping up from a point of hope, regardless of how we got here or how unfair it is that it took this long, I do think that we are at a turning point. I do think that we are at a point of change. I think that we are at a point where this youngest generation and this, you know, newer voters and that sort of thing are much more entrenched in the notion of allyship. And I think that because of that, and because that then causes proximity to the impacted people, right? It's very easy to look at a TV screen and hear a story and say that someone deserved something, right? And deserved certain conduct. It's quite a different thing to be standing next to that person bleeding or hearing the crack of bones, you know, from a billy club or from a police officer's aggression. It's very different when your child comes home from school and describes what happened to a classmate, you know, when school police came in and drug someone out of their chair or drug a young person by their hair and that sort of thing. I think that, you know, like you said, Selena, it's always been here. Now we just have cameras, right? And so because of that, I'm hopeful that the collective consciousness will feel the suffering and therefore want to end it.
I'm next. I follow up with what Alisa said about the new Jim Crow, the book. I think 13th is on the Netflix documentary is a good one, but I think the new Jim Crow, if for any of you skeptics out there who are skeptical about the origins of our system and why it's the way that it is, I would ask you to read the new Jim Crow. Also, the book Just Mercy, not just the movie. The book tells some incredible stories of people who have suffered in the system. Brian Stevenson, he is an incredible advocate and attorney, and he has the EJI. So if you want to donate to something, let it be Brian Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative. Until We Reckon is a book that talks about restorative justice in a very thoughtful way, about the issue with violence and how do we counter violence. Also, of course, we need to mention the quintessential abolitionist, Angela Davis, and Our Prisons Obsolete is a great shorter book. As far as documentaries, I think Central Park 5 is amazing. Until They See Us is a must watch if you haven't watched it. I think the world has took note to that. What I would say to you, I don't know where everyone is in their journey in terms of the issue of freedom, right? But what I would caution you to not to be fooled by fear mongers. There are certain politicians and the police officers unions who craft the narrative of the boogeyman is out to get you. And to look at the numbers in terms of violent crime, and to look at the data and the evidence, and to question those narratives that are crafted for you. And I think that if you want to do something to further the issues of defunding and divestment into, you make sure your local officials actually pass a budget that reflects your ideals. And so if that means if they're not cutting their police department's union, if they're not investing in alternatives to incarceration, they shouldn't have your vote if you are a person who is pushing the narrative forward of freedom. Also, who is your local DA, right? When are they up for election? And where do they stand on the issues? Where do they stand on mentally ill people being treated and not caged? Where do they stand on the death penalty? Where do they stand on mass incarceration? Find these things out and fight with your vote, right? Write letters if you want to. Go on social. I'm an avid Instagrammer, lawyer chick on Instagram. I think you should follow people who are part of the conversation so you can become informed and aware. There's also a couple podcasts, Abettor and Abettor. It's done by my buddy up north in Santa Clara Public Defender's Office. He does a podcast, as well as in LA, Another Not Guilty is a podcast about our wins in the system. And so just educate yourself, read, watch, listen to these various avenues so that you become more informed. And since I'm the recruiter for the LA County Public Defender's Office, you can always, volunteer, intern, and see if you want to enter this work on the ground level where the public defenders are. I think we're the army of freedom. And so join us or think about it.
Army of Freedom, that's right. I want to thank Selena Flores, Tiffiny Townend, and Alisa Blair I admire all three of you more than words can say. I think Tiffiny and Alisa are very humble, and if people even knew a fourth of what they do, people would be like, gotta watch this episode because they're rock stars in their field. I want to thank UC Riverside and the Ethnic Studies Department who is sponsoring this freedom course. And I urge any of you, we'll put our contact. If you have any questions, you can email one of us. I'm going to end with the poem I wrote. It's called Static. And I use this definition out of dictionary.com, very millennial, defined as pertaining to or characterized by a fixed or stationary condition or interference due to such atmospheric disturbances and electricity. Can you hear me screaming in my head, let my people go, let me go, saying let us go, release everyone from the system that hurts us all. I used to think I could work within it, but it's broken. Can you hear me screaming in your ear? Listen to me, please, listen, listen. Let me do what I do, then let me go from this misery of banging my head. My ears are ringing from the beat of cuffs on bars of cells across America. Are you there? Can you hear me screaming your name? It all still remains. Excuse me, excuse you, forgive me, forgive us all. We know not what we do, or like Tiffiny said, or maybe we do.